From the UCLA Labor Center and KPFK, this is Rework. I'm Saba Waheed.
And I'm Veena Hampapur.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear their voices still calling from across the years.
Dear friends, welcome to the Labor Radio Podcast Network series highlighting the work of our members. The growing network of over 80 shows in 5 countries serves as a one-stop shop for audiences looking for labor content and as a resource for labor broadcasters, podcasters, and content producers. My name is Evan Papp, and I produce Empathy Media Lab's podcast on labor, political economy, arts, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Saba Waheed and Veena Hampapur, who co-host Rework, which is a women-led radio show and podcast that spotlights the voices of workers, immigrants, and people of color in partnership with the UCLA Labor Center. Rework also trains community producers and students in multimedia story production and includes curriculum and educational tools that use stories to learn about work. So happy to talk to you both. Could one of you begin by introducing yourself, where you grew up, and what got you interested in labor issues?
Thanks, Evan. Nice to be on your show. So my name is Saba Waheed, and I grew up in Los Angeles, and spent some time in the Bay Area and made it to New York, which is really where I got activated into the labor world. When I was out there, I actually had a background in kind of literature and the soft social sciences, and was interested in things like marketing and publishing and not necessarily labor. But when I got to New York, I met some folks in the taxi union out there, like the Taxi Worker Center and the Taxi Workers Alliance. And I started volunteering with them to basically design their newsletter called Shift Change. And this was like 1999, total like old school, when you would have the like actual like newspapers that they would leave at the taxi stands and at like the hole in the wall places where drivers would go to eat. And I would show up at like 10 p.m. because that's when most of the taxi folks were working, and then work till like 2-3 in the morning designing. And it was really amazing. That was what I brought. That was my skill set. That was my interest, which was very much storytelling. And from there, I actually didn't expect to be a kind of a labor researcher. But what happened at 9/11 happened around that, within a couple of years. And one of my first research projects ended up going back to the Taxi Workers Alliance, or actually they came to me. And they're like, let's do this research project about the impact of 9/11 on drivers and getting them FEMA aid. And it was one of my first research projects. To me, like, it suddenly made sense what it meant to have community-based, worker-led research. And that kind of shaped how I became a researcher. And also, kind of always coupling with it, like how research and media could be tools for storytelling, especially of stories of workers and workers being able to tell those stories themselves.
Very cool. Very cool. And Veena, what about you?
I also grew up in Los Angeles, and I found myself back here when I started graduate school in anthropology at UCLA. I finished my PhD in sociocultural anthropology a few years ago. And my field site while I was doing my degree was out in New York, working with South Asian immigrants and their children, focusing on how race, immigration, education, and policing kind of all inform each other in post 9/11 America. And while I was out there, I got involved with doing communications and film work with an organization called Drum, which works with, it's a multi-generational South Asian organization. So I started to find myself really enjoying that work and thinking about going outside of academia when I graduated. And so after I finished my field work there, I was back in LA finishing up my dissertation. I was also creating different documentary films, just like out of personal interest, and then also for advocacy purposes. And then when I graduated, a job in communications opened up at the UCLA Labor Center. And so I work on the communications team now. And Rework was actually founded by Saba and our former director of communications, Stephanie Ritopper. And, Saba asked me if I would be interested in working on the show with her. And I was really excited because it brought together sort of the different aspects of my background with anthropology and interviewing, who I was interested in speaking with, and then also my multimedia background. So it sort of all like came together with working on Rework.
So just for a little background on the UCLA Labor Center, it was started, I guess, from California AFL-CIO and the University of California in 1964. And it was focused on labor research and education. Could you talk just a little bit about what the UCLA Labor Center is currently focusing on? And I think it's so awesome that you're working out of a university. So.
I guess maybe I can give like a general, some general information on the Labor Center, and maybe Saba can talk about current work since she's our research director. So, at the UCLA Labor Center, we believe that a public university belongs to the people. And I think our programs and what we offer and our research are really informed by that. And, we're committed to advancing quality education and employment for everybody. And we bring together workers, students, faculty members, and policy members, policymakers to address whatever the current critical issues are facing working people today. And Saba has, I'll let her talk about our research justice model and some of the work that she's doing.
Thanks, Veena. Yeah, I mean, in that model, it's very much partnering with worker centers and unions and developing research projects that support and kind of lift up the conditions that happen in order to inform policy and campaigns. So we've done all kinds of research, everything from, minimum wage to scheduling practices in retail stores. I think we've also done projects, that aren't common. We just did a big study with UFCW, a binational study of over 1,000 union workers, but about LGBTQ plus issues in the workplaces and conditions in the workplaces.
And real quickly, just for the audience who may not be key to the lingo, UFCW is United Food Commercial Workers.
Thank you. I just assume everybody knows. And last year, for example, we moved a lot of projects to think about the impact of COVID. So looking at nail salons, gig workers, students. We spent a lot of time having students do surveys about the experience of students as workers and as participants in the labor movement. So basically, trying to think about who our partners are, what are workforces that you aren't necessarily hearing stories about, or where do you need research to better lift up the stories, doing that then research, and then bringing in the radio show to give it even kind of bring in the storytelling component to uplift some of that research.
So for those who may not be interested or aware of labor news, why do you think unions and organized labor should be covered by the media?
I mean, it's in many sense, we're all workers, right? And so it's all of our stories in different ways. And unions and worker centers are often at the forefront of workforces that may be overlooked or that may be overlooked. And so for us, even when we were thinking about rework, it wasn't to kind of put a hammer on our audience to think about workers in a particular way. It was about thinking about how we're all human and we all have shared experiences, and let's connect because there's often not enough conversation where we're trying to connect with each other. But then let's understand that certain workers in our workforce are experiencing working conditions that are way worse than others, right? And that's what unions and worker centers are there to do. They're there to intervene. They're there to better. They're there to make those things visible. And we need to be talking about those. Even in the pandemic, there are folks who got to stay home and work with security, and then there were other folks who had to keep going into the workplace and put themselves and their communities at risk. So for us, being able to understand, that we need to think about the dignity of work, that there are workers that are earning low wages or working in exploitive conditions, and why aren't we thinking about them more, or why aren't we more activated around what's happening in these different workplaces? And for us, both the radio, the kind of work that you all are doing, the kind of work that the unions and worker centers are doing, it's all to bring that forward and make people understand, make people act about those conditions and demand better. And if anything happened last year with talking about essential workers, they were always essential. Why did it take a pandemic for us to see that they are essential? And it's given us a platform. It's given unions a platform to really push that forward, and we can't forget it. Now that we understand heroes and we understand essential, we can't stop there. And so using the platforms that we have to make sure that people continue to think about workers and work conditions.
Well, that brings me to the next question to talk about your show, Rework. Could you talk about the process of starting the show and what it's about, and what you're looking at in 2021?
I'll do quickly what started, and then maybe Veena can move to the other two parts of that question. But our show started about 8 years ago, and there's this old time amazing union organizer, leader, activist, Henry Walton. And if you should check out, we did a special interview with him. So there's a Rework episode that talks about his story. 20 years he ran this show on KPFK on the Pacifica Network, and he basically did interviews with unions and workers in an interview style. So he passed away a couple of years ago, and but before he did, a couple of years before he passed away, he came to the Labor Center and was like, we need to keep labor on this station. It's a progressive radio station, but we need a labor voice on it. He thinks that UCLA Labor Center was the best space to do it. And so when he passed it on to us, like Veena was saying, Stephanie and I were at the Labor Center at the time, and we thought about it and decided, rather than doing the interview format, is to go for a storytelling format, in the ways that I described earlier, about thinking about stories as a way to bring the personal element and then the political element. Once you've kind of connected with the person, then we can bring all the issues and the organizing, as the story develops, and kind of creating story arcs and things like that. So that's how it went from Henry Walton's Labor Review to Rework.
And Veena, yeah, could you talk a little bit about what's going on with the show today?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we format our show. We meet with people, and usually each interview is about 2 hours. We talk to people about their whole lives, from childhood to what their current job is. And I think this goes with what we mentioned earlier about seeing workers holistically, not just as workers, but parents, leaders, community members. And then we take that 2-hour interview and then we cut it into a 30-minute show. So it is pretty edited. We, think a lot about what music we can bring in, what archival footage. So we're not trying to hit people over the head with the points that we're trying to make, we're hoping people will connect more naturally, just hearing the story of someone and what they've gone through and what they're up to. I think a lot of times in the mainstream media, immigrants and workers are portrayed as victims. And I think on our show, we might, demonstrate that vulnerability, but also their agency as well. And I think another thing that's cool about this format is it shows how different social issues intersect. So, for example, our last couple episodes, just in telling these people's stories brings together criminal justice and immigration and, the presence of police surveillance in, traditionally nurturing institutions like schools or, supposed to be traditionally nurturing. So yeah, we look at people's whole lives and then we also place them in this larger context. And this year, we are currently figuring out what our episodes will be. We do have a few episodes coming up focusing on Black women in Los Angeles. Our next couple episodes will be with birth workers here in South LA. So we're still developing, what the rest of the year will look like. Everything is very up in the air with the pandemic and what that leads to, but that's what we have coming up in the pipeline next. So we are recording remotely for everyone's safety, and that's just what we have to do. And with our episodes, we air them on KPFK, but we also always release them as a podcast too. This started last year, so our last few episodes are all up on all the major podcasting platforms.
Awesome. And talking about the Labor Radio Podcast Network, could you talk about how you heard about it? And we're always trying to expand the network to provide just more camaraderie and solidarity with people who want to start their own podcast. So could you discuss about how you heard about it and why you think this network is important? I can start with Veena, yeah.
I was actually going to say maybe we should start with Saba because she's the one who told me about it.
You all reached out to us, so we appreciate that. And it was actually many years ago, and I don't remember who it was, but someone reached out to Stephanie, and she was also our communications director. So it was a natural fit for us to be talking to other folks who are thinking about labor and radio. And so from there, we got on your listserv and got on your meetings. And then, most recently, Veena jumped in and started attending your meetings and participating more actively. And perhaps, Veena, you can talk about why you think that space is important.
Yeah, Evan, I think you sort of named it when you mentioned camaraderie and solidarity. I think a lot of times I'm just in my little closet editing away, and it's really nice to talk to other people around the country, and I think even internationally, about their projects and what they're passionate about and what they've learned doing this work. They're such great speakers that come to our meetings, and I feel like I'm just learning from everyone all the time about labor, but then also how to produce a radio show on podcast. With COVID and all the changes that brought, it was nice to have a space where I could, talk to people about how do we continue the radio show in this time. So that's been really great. And, Saba and I are invited to speak on campus pretty regularly. UCLA has a labor studies program. We have a major, and a lot of the students are interested in labor, interested in podcasting, interested in the arts. So it's really cool that the network has this great website with all the different shows on there, these spotlights. So just 2 weeks ago, we spoke to a class and I was able to mention the website. So if students want to see what's out there beyond our show, they can go check it out, and everything is consolidated there for them. And I think that's really great.
Awesome. We just updated the website, and we're trying to make it a little more engaging and get more resources for folks on there. And same thing, I've learned so much from people, and there's the up and coming podcasters from places like Australia, and then there's the grizzled veterans from San Francisco and Texas, and in Judy Ansell and Kansas City Heartland Labor Radio Forum, which has been on air for 30 years. It's just an incredible space, and I've learned so much. And Rework is another show that I didn't know about until I got involved. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing too.
I think one more thing I wanted to add is I think we're at a really interesting moment where so many of us are working remotely. So I feel like that kind of expands the possibilities in terms of what can be a podcast or on the radio. So for example, at the Labor Center, we have this other labor education series called Labor's Voice, where we talk to different labor leaders. And, it's a Zoom webinar, but then being a part of the network made me realize like, hey, this is like a lot like a lot of the other labor shows out there. I just hadn't like seen it that way. So I think we're sort of in an interesting moment, just with technology and people having more access and what can count as a podcast and what should be put out there.
So in closing, looking into the future of organized labor, where do each one of you see opportunity and hope?
I mean, I feel like we're in a pretty big shift change, to use the name of the taxi newsletter. There's just such a positive perception of unions that we haven't seen in a real long time. There are new workforces that are getting organized and unionized that have never like been unionized before. I just, I really feel like it's been a really difficult time for workers. And I think that like labor unions have stepped up and have really shown so much leadership and really inspiring campaigns everywhere from like the $4 hazard pays to organizing childcare. This is a lot of California, so like those are the campaigns we're definitely more familiar with. So it makes me really hopeful that there are things moving locally and nationally that's really about thinking of workers as central and thinking about improving workplaces and thinking, like Veena said, about workers holistically, as community, as neighbors, as, thinking about housing, thinking about food access, like thinking about immigration status. So I feel like there's a lot to be hopeful about.
I think Saba put that very nicely. I guess the one thing that I would add is I feel a lot of hope when I get to meet with our labor studies students. They just have so much passion for learning about social justice, but also getting involved directly. And I think that's been one thing that's really neat, seeing at UCLA how with the Labor Center, they can get directly involved in the research. They can help out with the radio show. They're learning about these issues, in labor studies. And so whenever I get a chance to interact with them, I'm really heartened by seeing how much passion and curiosity they bring to this world.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, and one of us is chained. None of us are free, 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 and one of us is chained. None of us are free. There are people in darkness, they just can't see the light. If we don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right. We got to feel for each other. Let our brothers know we're here. Got to get the message, send it out all loud and clear. None of us are free. None of us are free. None of us are free. If one of us is chained, none of us are free. It's the single truth we all need to see. None of us are free. If one of us is chained, none of us are free. Well, I swear to you, salvation isn't very hard to find. None of us can find it on our own. We got to join together.